Flans Across the River by Nick Warburton. Flan Trouble. Rodney! Mr. Bodney the baker dusted the flour from his hands and called for his son. His son, Rodney, was snoozing in the chair by the big oven. Mr. Bodney tweaked his ear and woke him up. "Listen," he said, "I want you to take 5 sticky syrupy flans to Mr. Crab's shop." "Right-o, Dad," said Rodney, yawning. "Mr. Crab's shop, on the other side of the river." "Yes, and don't dawdle and don't daydream or I'll go up the wall. Mr. Crab doesn't want these flans tomorrow, he wants them today." "Yes, Dad," said Rodney, "leave it to me." He tucked the box of flans under his arm and set off for Mr. Crab's shop. He walked along the river bank until he came to the wooden bridge, or rather, he came to the place where the bridge used to be, and his mouth fell open. The bridge had collapsed. The middle part had fallen into the river and floated away. "Now what am I going to do?" he said. Mr. Crab came out of his shop on the other side of the river and called across to him. "Have you got my flans, Rodney?" he shouted. Rodney looked at the river swirling by, and he looked at the box of sticky, syrupy flans. "I've got them here, Mr. Crab," he shouted. "I don't want them there," called Mr. Crab. "I want them here." "I can't cross the river without a bridge," thought Rodney. Then he had an idea. "Just coming, Mr. Crab," he said. "I'll use the box as a boat and float the flans across. Get ready." Rodney put the box of flans on the water and held his breath. "It'll be awful if they sink," he thought to himself. The flans didn't sink. They bobbed out onto the river like a little boat. "Clever," said Rodney to himself. But at that moment the box swirled in the current and the flans began to float downstream. Then some ducks plunged into the river after them. The ducks made such a noise that several more people joined Mr. Crab on the other side of the river. They wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Rodney ran along the river bank trying to keep up with the floating flans. He grabbed a stick and managed to steer the box back to the shore. By then, though, the ducks had pecked one of the flans away to nothing. "Now look what you've done," Rodney said to the ducks. "I've only got 4 left, and Dad will go up the wall." The ducks paddled about, watching Rodney to see what he would do next. Rodney didn't know what to do, so he sat down on the river bank and thought. As he sat there, Rodney noticed that a stiff breeze was blowing. It was blowing across the river towards Mr. Crab's shop. "Of course," he thought, "I'll sail them across." Not very clever. Rodney jumped up and took off his shirt. Using the stick as a mast, he made a sail for the box of syrupy flans. The box was quite soggy after its first trip, so Rodney only floated 1 flan out onto the river. The wind caught the shirt sail and the box began to move across the river. Rodney heard some cheering from the other bank. Quite a crowd had gathered outside Mr. Crab's shop. The ducks quacked and set off after the box. Very clever, Rodney thought to himself when it was halfway across. Then the wind dropped. The little boat stopped sailing and Rodney's shirt dragged in the water. Rodney tried to puff at it from his side of the river, but he knew it was no good. The box began to bob away down the river with the ducks paddling after it as fast as they could go. "Oh no!" cried the crowd. Rodney sat down and thought again. He looked at the 3 flans that were left. He looked at the other shore. It was too far to throw a flan, he thought, but a kick might do it. "It's worth a try," he cried, jumping to his feet. "He's going to kick it," yelled someone from the crowd. 3 or 4 more people came running up to watch. Rodney held one of the flans in front of him. He dropped it and swung his foot as hard as he could. The crowd shouted with excitement and a little dog barked. It was such a strong kick that it lifted Rodney clean off the ground, but the flan did not fly into the air. It made a loud splat and stuck to Rodney's foot. The crowd across the river laughed out loud. "Oh dear," said Rodney, wiping syrup from his bare chest. "I must find a way of getting flans over the river without exploding them first." Then he remembered his stretchy belt. If he fixed it to the branch of a tree, he could make a catapult. If he shot a flan from a catapult, it might not explode. Really very clever, he told himself. It took him some minutes to fix his belt to a nearby tree. It wasn't easy because his trousers kept slipping down. In the end, he had to take them off altogether. The crowd clapped and cheered to see him skipping about in his stripy pants. When the catapult was ready, Rodney pulled the belt back as far as it would go. He had to lean back on the grass to do it. 3, 2, 1, Fire! Shouted the crowd, and Rodney let go of the belt. The flan went spinning high over the water like a discus. Look out, Mr. Crab, Rodney called. Flan on its way. This time the flan cleared the river. It hung in the air for a moment, and the crowd waited ready to catch it. Down it came, and everyone ran forward with their arms out. Mine, mine, called Mr. Crab. Then Mr. Crab stumbled over the little dog and sat down on the bank with a thump. Oh no, said Rodney, and closed his eyes. Rodney heard a loud slap as the flan landed. Then he heard the crowd cheer. When Rodney opened his eyes, Mr. Crab was sitting there with the flan on his head like a floppy hat. Don't worry, Mr. Crab, Rodney called. There's one flan left, and I'm sure I can get it to you all right. Don't go away. But the crowd was now so big that Mr. Crab couldn't go away if he wanted to. One last chance, thought Rodney, or Dad really will go up the wall. He picked up his trousers and tied a knot in each of the legs. Then he took some string from his pockets. He began to tie it round the last flan. What's he up to this time? Shouted a man on the other side of the river. Flantastic. It's a parachute, someone answered. Rodney Bodney's making a parachute with his trousers. And that's just what Rodney was doing. He wrapped the flan carefully in his trousers and stretched his belt as far as it would go. 3, 2, 1, fire! Yelled the crowd. Off went the flan and the crowd gasped. Ooh, ah! The flan began to tumble out of the sky. It fell down like a stone. Look out, shouted the crowd, and everyone ducked. Then the trousers filled with air. They became as fat as 2 balloons and floated slowly, rocking from side to side towards the ground. The flan dropped gently into Mr. Crab's weighted arms, and an even louder cheer went up. He's done it, yelled a voice. 3 cheers for Rodney Bodney. Hip, hip, hooray! Everyone was glad that the flan had landed safely. Everyone but Rodney. He turned away and went home feeling sorry for himself. 4 sticky, syrupy flans, a shirt and a pair of good trousers, all lost. Not at all clever, and what was Dad going to say? When he got home, he found Mr. Bodney waiting for him at the bakery door. Rodney felt foolish standing there in nothing but his stripy pants. He looked down and saw smudges of sticky syrup on his chest and legs. He was sure that Mr. Bodney was about to go right up the wall, but the baker was smiling. Mr. Crab has just been on the phone, he said to Rodney. Ah, yes, said Rodney, swallowing hard. I can explain that. I really did try my best. He wants to thank you for the flan, Mr. Bodney went on. He said he's had a wonderful morning. Rodney could hardly believe his ears. He was sure that Mr. Crab would be hopping mad with him. A wonderful morning, he said. Yes, said Mr. Bodney. He says he's never seen such a crowd before. They've been in and out of his shop all morning, and all because of you. Well, said Rodney, smiling with relief, I did my very best. Mr. Bodney smiled too and patted his son on the back. Mr. Crab wants you to deliver 5 more sticky, syrupy flans for him tomorrow, he said, just the same as today.